Okay, this is actually in the late 1970s, so your parents were probably growing up then, not the 50s and 60s. So, not that long ago, but you can see what a long way we've come, from then to now. And I want to first begin with, we are often these days, we're talking about the challenges we're facing as a society, about growing pockets of vulnerability and so forth. I want to frame that in the global context. And really, if you look at the world around us, we're not faring too badly. Every year, the UN comes up with the Human Development Index that looks at, human well-being, how well people are faring in various countries across the world. And Singapore has consistently fared pretty high on it. Last year, we were ranked 26th out of 185 countries in the very high human development group. They look at things like, quality of life, life expectancy, education, and so forth. And in fact, we were actually ranked even higher than UK. We also, I don't know how many of you know this, but we have the highest proportion of millionaire households in the world, and this excludes the home you live in. So we are quite, with one in six households on that rich list. So which is again, a measure of how prosperous many Singaporeans are. And of course, we have the highest life expectancy rates. We also, you guys know, we have very high home ownership rates. And something that has been in the news of late, especially in Europe, compared to Europe where unemployment is at more than 10%, more than 20% for youth, we have an overall unemployment rate of only 2.1%. But having said that, of course, as a society, we are facing some big challenges, and I want to briefly touch on one and then go into a bit more detail on the other. These are two important demographic, social challenges we are facing today. One, of course, is on income inequality. I won't dwell too much on it because I believe Janadas Devan spoke about it in an earlier talk. But, essentially the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. I thought I'll talk about one piece of some numbers here, just to give you a sense of how many low-income workers we have here. About 10 years ago, there were around 218,000 low-income workers who actually earn less than $1,000 a month. And despite all this prosperity growth, as you see, the numbers of those earning $1,000 and below hasn't really fallen dramatically. In fact, it's increased a bit. Meanwhile, wages at the upper end have increased almost threefold. These are both, wages from both part-time and full-time work. And then the second issue, which I'm going to dwell on at some length here today, is we are aging faster than ever before. In fact, if you guys Google something called an aging world, you will see this quite scary graph which shows that, the rate of aging over the next 30, 40 years, and Singapore's right on top, number one among 50 countries, surveyed by the US Census Bureau. And so our numbers are, the numbers of older folk here are going to double in under a decade and then triple to nearly 1 million by 2030. Do you all know why that is so? Why we are aging so rapidly? Any of you? It's quite obvious, really. We have among the highest lifespans in the world. I think Singapore women are living longer than almost, anyone else in the world. In 1960, a person born here could expect to live 65 years. Last year, it had risen to 82 years. And then, as you all also know, we do have among the lowest fertility rates in the world, currently at 1.2. Hopefully, Year of the Dragon will bring more babies, but we are really a long way away from the 2.1, which is the replacement rate. And here I also want to talk about something called the old age support ratio. As young people, in any country, young people work, they pay taxes, they support older folk. And in Singapore in 1970, there were about 17 such young people for every 65-year-old. And by last year, that had fallen to like nearly 8. So that group is shrinking very, very fast. While we're living longer, we are not really living very well. So, old age depression, loneliness, these are some issues which are on the rise. As you can see here, over the past, right now, over the past decade, the number of old folk, people above 65, has gone up by about 50%. But the proportion of people who live alone or live with an elderly spouse has actually doubled. And despite Singapore being known to be having very strong family ties, so we are seeing increasing numbers of older folk in our midst who are really living all alone. Many are quite depressed. I want to briefly mention Mr. Ng, who I met a few years ago. He was a divorcee, lived alone in a one-room rental flat, and I met him at the hospital bed. He had actually tried to starve himself to death because he was very depressed. He couldn't walk, and he just couldn't go down to the void deck to meet, his friends. And so he just he just stopped eating. And then, luckily, this very proactive social worker actually went up to look for him, and they found him sprawled on the floor. He was subsequently transferred to hospital, and that's where I met him. And he actually lifted up his shirt, and I said, "Why would you want to do something like that?" And he said, "I have nothing to live for." And he was all, skin and bones. And sadly, he was diagnosed with cancer, and he passed away shortly after that. So, there are huge groups of older folk who are poor, who are alone, living in our midst, and that's something we should all be concerned about and see what we can help. Again, people like Mr. Ng, as I said, disability is also growing. So not only are people more people living alone, there are also a lot of people who are immobile. I mean, they might be living quite long, but people with mobility problems, that group has also doubled in the past decade. The state, of course, is well aware of the pressures because of our demographic challenges, and increasingly every year they're pouring in more and more funds to combat it. Last year there was a 700 million injection into an elder care fund, and there's this community silver trust fund where for of elder care services which where the government will match private donations dollar for dollar. Then community-based services, home health services, all these are also being ramped up to cater more to our elderly. And the government, I'm sure you're aware, is also trying to do its best to keep older folk employed for as long as possible. This year they increased CPF rates for older workers. They started giving wage subsidies to companies that hire older workers, and there's a new Re-employment Act. So all this, all this is hopefully will go, a great length in helping these people. Safety nets, social safety nets in terms of ComCare and other social safety programs that we have are also being strengthened every year. Eligibility criteria are being relooked and recalibrated, and so that more people become eligible for help. Yet, the pockets, the visible vulnerabilities, some people would say are growing. I've been following poor people here for many years now, and you do tend to see more and more such folk.